Hey there, and welcome to the second episode of Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout turned corporate innovator who thinks that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck. Admittedly, it often does. By some stats, up to 80% of workers are unsatisfied at work. And on the flip side of this, the paradox is that folks are expecting more and more for their work to create meaning and purpose in their lives, basing their identity right inside those roles at work. And then the pandemic and the Great Resignation, all of this has forced us to take a look at quality of life and what culture really means for people inside of organizations. I want to say that I do think that business and corporate, it's all cool. I think that building things and creating something is one of the best parts of being alive. It's the best way, one of the best ways of living out, manifesting human potential. A couple things about this recording. One is that I reference self-leadership and I also reference living blueprints. And I just wanted to put some context there, if this is the first time you're hearing me, that Living Blueprints is the company, the speaking workshops business that came before the Work Dope podcast. So it's a little irrelevant, but I just wanted to set a little bit of tone there. Another one is that I'm noticing that I'm talking really fast, and this has been part of feedback that I've gotten for years. And now that I'm hearing myself back on these recordings, I hear it more and more. I have recorded the third episode, and I feel that I am slowing down. I hope it's not distracting, especially on occasion you'll hear me take a breath. Also, I want to remind that if you have any stories that resonate, that are similar, stories about kind of egregious things that have happened in your work environment and you'd like to share, and this can be with total anonymity, I would either share by reading what you write, or if you want to record what happened on a voice recorder, some kind of recording app on your phone, and then email it to me, and we'll talk about how we would use it in the podcast. My email is linda@workdopepod.com. That's Linda at WORKDOPEPOD.com. And finally, there's a little bit of swearing in here. So if you have kids around or you don't want to hear it, you have been forewarned. Enjoy the podcast. Hey there. Welcome to Work Dope. I'm Linda Stacy, and we are continuing to set the tone for Work Dope on this second episode. We're going to be talking more about foundational premises, the things that are behind why we're doing Work Dope. So some of the themes today, we're going to be talking about models in the workplace and what that looks like. We're also going to get clear on what we have control over, whether we're individual contributors or mid-managers or the executives in the firm. We're going to be talking about taking ownership, what it means to be empowered, no matter where you are in the organization, and what agency is. You might not get permission slips to start acting from a place of inner authority. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. So we're starting with the first part, actually, of self-leadership. And self-leadership is something that is behind the Living Blueprints model. And there are three primary aspects to self-leadership. One is around productivity and self-management, knowing how to organize your workday so that you can get a lot of things done. Another one is around self-awareness, and the other one is around relational awareness. So today we're going to be talking about things that really fall into the self-awareness aspect. So when I talk about models in the workplace, whether or not you have a mentor or something like this can be so important to your success, especially if you see them early on. I myself have been in roles kind of in a very small functional group, usually of an organization. So at most times there were only a handful of us, sometimes only one or two people. So it can be very difficult to learn from someone or to model behavior when you don't have a lot of people to look to. At least it can feel that way. You can look outside of your own functional group if you have an idea of what that is. I'm going to give an example of what I mean by this modeling thing in just a second. But from my own experience, when I was first in the workplace, I had a boss who threatened our vendors. Literally, it was very, very kind of unprofessional phone etiquette with our vendors. Clearly not a model that I wanted to copy, and took me a while actually to understand how to work with vendors. They actually help us quite a bit. Why wouldn't I want to be a professional, happy, partner with them? I also had an example. My sister years ago kind of early in her career, not too early in her career. She had a boss who was having marital issues and would like be having these arguments in her office, banging the phone on the receiver. Is this really the type of, modeled behavior that people want to copy? Anyway, so if you're working a very small team, or maybe only a handful of people have the same role as you do, or you're in a small organization or a startup, it can be really hard sometimes to find people to model. So my first example of what this actually was and how it worked for me was back when I was in high school. When I was in the 8th grade, I was trying out to be a cheerleader for high school. And this, a few years, maybe it was 2 years prior to that, Greg Louganis had been I'm assuming he was a gold medal winner in the Olympics. And he was interviewed, as they often do these little outtakes, during the Olympics. And he was talking about visualization and how important that was to his diving. And I had never been introduced to this concept. So, a couple of years later, and I'm thinking about the cheerleading competition and how important it was for me to, competition, the tryouts is what I'm really talking about. It was important to me to make it on the team. I kind of wanted that place, starting out my high school career, if you will. And I did use it. I mean, I would go through that routine in my head again and again and again. And I really had it down. I did end up making the squad that year, which was interesting. And I made it the second year too. I did not, in fact, make it my junior and senior year, but that's probably a story for another time. And I hope I'm not terribly judged by some people who have certain stereotypes around what it is to be a cheerleader. Kind of a side point, but Greg Louganis, it was a powerful technique, right? Totally influenced my performance. It influenced my ability to make the squad. And I had never really been introduced to this type of technique or these ways of kind of creating something or achieving something in a way, using these tools that a lot of self-performance people talk about. So how can we apply this to the workplace, right? We need Greg Louganis models for work life. We don't often have that. There's so much weird stuff that happens at work. Work dope is to allow people really to see themselves in a situation. So I'm hoping with the examples that I use, at some point you can see yourself in a situation and say like, oh, or you can think about how you handled a situation or how you could help someone else handle a situation. All of this, to provide tips and reflection, ultimately for your own performance improvement and satisfaction, however that looks for you in your work. This is all about success on your terms. And like I said in previous episode, too many humans hate their jobs. And I think that's a real shame when I think, we spend so much time at work, and it really is a place where we can do some of the primary cool things about being alive. And Tim Ferriss talks about us being on the planet in order to grow, produce, and change. And create might be part of that. Produce and create are kind of one and the same. But I really believe that if we're doing that, if we're doing like one of those three things or all of them, we're having a more successful life, a more meaningful life overall. And to spend so many hours of life at work or in a job where you feel like none of those things are really happening, it's extremely confining, draining, and your world kind of feels like a prison. So we're going to talk again, like I said before, about this underlying premise around self-leadership and the ability to control the things that we have control over in our workday and work life. And again, self-leadership will be one focus here. We're going to talk about how we react to things and our self-awareness. We have control over three things, no matter who we are. And those are our actions, our reactions, and our mindset. These are all foundational to self-leadership concepts, and I really believe that anyone in an organization should be geared on having some amount of ability to execute in these areas. How good we are at any of this self-leadership is going to be determined by our background and the modeling, like I talked of before. And, just a host of complex determinants that kind of lead to the human being that we become. So we don't come out of the womb awesome at all of these things. All of these concepts are going to be talked about further in Work Dope episodes. But again, today will be kind of around why we react the way we do and how this feeds into self-awareness. So how do you act and react? This can be really tough, especially early in your career. knowing what's acceptable, knowing what's reasonable, knowing how to work and navigate within all of this. It takes a while to figure out. And we don't want to be difficult as human beings, right? We're at the workplace, hopefully, potentially, to be helpful and not to be seen as being a difficult to work with person. And I've heard people sometimes bring things to the boss or an authority, and the undertone in the way that they're asking for something is, this is how you, boss, are not serving me. I've seen this in workshops. I've seen it, it just, this undertone comes out in the group dynamic that the employee is saying, in not overtly, but it's coming through in their tone and the way they're asking questions. This is how you are not serving me. And it's true a lot of times that employees are not getting exactly what they need in order to be effective. So I'm not arguing that at all. But I do think there could be a shift in the way that we approach, because if the undertone has this kind of negative bent to it, sometimes the leaders are picking up on it, even if they don't really recognize what they're picking up on. And then they're going to come back at you. You're on defense, they're on offense. And then it becomes kind of, you don't really get anywhere with it. And it certainly doesn't feel good on either side. And feeling good, I just want to say again, there can be discomfort before there's awesomeness. This isn't about feeling joyful all of the time. But really, if you do need something from your boss, instead of having this undertone of, this is why you're not giving me what I need, you really need to come from the angle of, this is what I need to be successful. And maybe you don't even know what success looks like. Maybe that hasn't been made clear. So you need to align with your boss or whoever this person is on what success looks like. And, you could even say, this is how I see the end result being a positive, this is what success looks like. Are we clear on that? Do we need to work on that? Just make sure that you're on the same page, very open-ended way, no accusations that you haven't been given enough information, all of these things. And then once you've aligned, you can scan for resources. What resources are available to you? I think sometimes we forget things that are available, whether it's in, internal databases that the company has, knowledge management systems. There's lots of information usually at people's fingertips. And there's also human beings who are fantastic sources of information. Who would know more about this? What resources are available to me? And once you've made that scan, and, if you can't begin to take the first initial steps because you don't have enough information yet, that's a time when you need to ask for what you need. This is what I found. This is the gap in my information, and then asking specifically for what you need from the boss in order to move something forward. So again, we don't want to be difficult when we ask for things in the work environment. And sometimes, not always, I see people in functional roles asking questions in ways that isn't really helping. It doesn't come across as though they're actually wanting to do the work, I guess, is how I see it sometimes. We certainly don't want to be coming across as passive aggressive. And at some point, we'll probably talk more about passive aggression and why people lean on that as kind of a coping mechanism instead of, direct communication. But hopefully what I just suggested could be a way to be less passive aggressive. And I'd probably even argue that most people who lean towards passive aggression don't realize that they do it, right? And this is about self-awareness again. So a great, great topic for future episodes. So there are many things we can do to actually set ourselves up for awesome days where we feel more in control of our actions, our reactions, and our mindset, even in work environments that are high in VUCA. I don't know if you have heard about this VUCA, V-U-C-A. It's an acronym that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments. I do get from folks on front lines and, workshops that I've organized and just lots of groups that I've been in front of where people think that their life is the most complex life. Their situation is the most distracted. Theirs is the most challenging. And I would argue that we all have really, really dynamic, challenging work environments where we're being distracted all of the time. And the more that we can operate fluidly within that without getting pissed off all the time is probably going to serve us well. So we talk about that. And when I say we want to set ourselves up for an awesome day, right? Even in these volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments. And by awesome, I don't mean that it's going to mean a day without interruption or a day without issues or a day without problems or frustrations. I just mean that it's aligned to some degree. You feel like you've contributed something and that you have sufficient energy. And when I said before what Tim Ferriss talks about in terms of, feeling like you've created, produced, that you're evolving in some way in life, overall, I would hope that work is allowing you to do this in the long run, in the long view. So it might not feel like that every day. Sometimes, it takes so many little tiny things that don't feel like anything to actually add up to success. You should and can, and there's an ebb and flow. We should expect an ebb and flow. Ebb and flow, good and bad, positive, negative. This is a continual experience that's constantly changing. Shifting slightly, I just want to talk about agency for a minute. I think people know what agency is, but maybe don't use this terminology or don't think about it really succinctly. And it's definitely part of a self-leadership mindset when it comes to, how you approach work. Again, no matter who you are in an organization, individual contributor, mid-manager, executive, director, whoever you are. I'm going to read from The Power of Agency. It's a book by Paul Napper and Anthony Rao, R-A-O. They define agency in a few bullet points, and I'm going to read those. Agency is what allows you to pause, evaluate, and act when you face a challenge, be it work, home, or anywhere else in the world. And just for a second, again, you're pausing, evaluating, and act. So we're not reacting super quickly, right? Second bullet, agency is about being active rather than passive, of reacting effectively to immediate situations and planning effectively for your future. So, thinking about how to be most effective in any situation, especially when it's challenging. When you become too overwhelmed and lose your agency, you can no longer evaluate your circumstances, reflect on the challenges and opportunities you're confronted with, make creative decisions, and then act in ways that open up possibilities for a meaningful life or work on your own terms. In simpler words, agency is what humans have always used to feel in command of their lives. With it, people are able to live in ways that reflect their interests, values, and inner motivations. And this is an area that becomes complicated at work. Are we able to actually live our values in the workplace? I would argue yes. I think you decide who you are when you show up in your workplace. Even if the work and the types of things that you're having to execute don't really resonate with who you are in your core. And I'd argue that a lot of the population is probably in a place where a lot of aspects of their work aren't super, jazzed or lined up with at a core level. We decide who we are when we show up at work. And something I've done in the past in a workshop form that I would likely make an episode in the future is this idea of creating, a brand inside the workplace. Who are you? Who do you show up as? And how does that line up with where you come from, your values, your background, and all of that? It can be very powerful for you just deciding who you are. A quick side note, bringing back to my sister. She worked in a role, I forget now if she was partially doing finance still at the time. She was kind of in an accounts payable situation until she moved into training roles. And she would send out, I don't know if it was a quarterly or an annual type of communication company-wide. And she always made it into a rhyming type of poem. I mean, clearly she was taking extra time to do that, but it really kind of got people to know who she was as a human being. It still conveyed the information and there was personality in it. And I think sometimes we might be afraid of our personality being okay in the workplace. And I'd like to argue that it is okay. I know I personally have felt like I wasn't sure if me being myself was okay. And the more that I've allowed that to come through, the easier and the better results I actually see. I also wanted to make a comment about part of what I just read, and that was when the authors say, when you become too overwhelmed and lose your agency, you can no longer evaluate your circumstances, reflect on the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea about being overwhelmed is huge. It goes back to what I was saying before about the VUCA environments, the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It's really easy to be overwhelmed in the workplace these days. You have to put things in place in order to have a better day. And it doesn't mean that it's no matter what, you're going to experience some work, right? Like you're going to have kind of an energy drain at the end of the day if you haven't put any thought into how you're going to organize your day. So the more that you can use tools to get yourself lined up so that the overwhelm doesn't become unbearable, so that you don't even get to the point of overwhelm, the better off you're going to be. So we're certainly going to be talking about those types of techniques in future episodes. It's one of those 3 premises that I talked about with self-leadership around self-management and, productivity skills, basic, some time management things. How do you manage time when you're getting an email every 4 minutes or whatever that is? At this point, I want to talk about some examples or stories around reactions, giving some examples from my own life, things that I've heard about the way that we can react and how it may or may not be serving us and what we're actually reacting to. I'm going to read something from Brené Brown, who I mentioned in the last episode, but this time what I'm reading comes from Daring Greatly, and I believe in Dare to Lead too. These are 2 of her earlier books, Dare to Lead and Daring Greatly. Brené says that meaning making is in our biology, and our default is to often come up with a story that makes sense, feels familiar, and offers us insight into how best to self-protect. So we make meaning of things because we're human, because it's in our biology, like she just said. So someone will say something, and we don't often look at information objectively, and that's smart, right? We kind of need to some degree, read into things in order to self-protect. And there was a time when that was really important, when life and death was really a situation, like if we think of ourselves back on the savannah. But we're not on the savannah anymore. We're now in the workplace, and our biological reactions are still as intense, and they're still rooted in fear. And fear is a mechanism that's there to protect us. It's something that is helpful for humans to stay alive. The issue is that we're not always really sure what we're reacting to or what the fear is based in. Or we might not even call it fear. We just get pissed off and we direct it at another person. So we're going to talk about some of these things. I just wanted to set that as a little bit of a premise. I will likely come back to it. So let's just think about email for a second. When we're reading an email, and say it's been kind of a tough day and we've been through a lot already and we really don't have much energy left, what's the tendency that we're reading something kind of with like an inner bitch voice or some kind of like snarky voice? Maybe it's a combination of inner bitch snarky voice. I will be totally honest. A lot of the time, my default is to read emails with, what did I do wrong? That's the undertone in that. I feel like maybe there's a likelihood that I'm going to be accused of not being clear enough, or that I didn't really offer a core solution. And I'm going to talk about this in relation to we all have these things. Other people might not be reading with a, what did I do wrong? But there are other undertones that we kind of add. We add layers to things. So my inner reader voice is literally like pulling from my personal fear archetype, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And it may or may not be helpful. Sometimes it is actually helpful. And one experiment, if you notice this is just something that you might notice when you're reading email in the course of the next week or whatever. Can you attempt to read every email as though it's your 18-year-old nephew? I use this because I have an 18-year-old nephew and I know how I would approach him. I know that he's very smart. I know that he's very capable. I know he's worthy of respect. And I also know he doesn't have a lot of information and experience in things. And that my core user in the workplace is only 5-6 years older than Joey. I mean, yeah, that's a lot of years when it comes to those developmental years in college and everything. But, it's the same thing. These are smart human beings deserving of respect. They just don't know things that I happen to know. And even though I've told 55 people before them the exact same thing, this person is new and they deserve a fresh, careful response from me. So I try to, when I'm feeling like I'm no longer kind of in my best place, I try to go back to what would be most helpful in terms of the way that I communicate to this person. How can I view them in the best possible way? I'm going to give a couple of other stories about how we react and why we react. One of this thing, sometimes we're reacting or we're getting upset because a rule has been broken. And we might not actually interpret that way, but that's the underlying thing. Like we're reacting because someone is not abiding to a rule that maybe we kind of subscribe to, but maybe they don't even know anything about it. We don't all subscribe to the same set of rules. I think sometimes we make assumptions and we're not even thinking about this. I kind of think it would be a really boring world if we did talk about diversity. That would be the opposite of diversity. And I'm going to give an example. So I've been working in a work environment where we have, the employers have offered us a variety of beverages, cold beverages for years, all different kinds of waters and sodas and coffees and on and on. And at one point, a new person on the block, again, probably a 23-year-old, asked for something quite specific to be added to the rotation. I don't know what it was. It kind of doesn't matter. Maybe a certain brand of Snapple, a certain type of soda or something like that. And I think he asked or he inquired about it with the worst possible person. How could he have known though? But the reaction that came back to him was this. It was kind of went along the lines of, name one company in a mile radius that currently has the offerings like this, like that was his reaction to this young new employee asking for a soda swap. My perspective is I know there's a lot of companies within a mile radius of this location that has in-office baristas. So be careful. We did not have an in-office barista, but the reaction, was really kind of dripping with disgust. I mean, that's kind of the underlying tone there, like the nerve of this kid to ask me for a different type of soda. And I'd ask right now, what's your reaction to this? Did the associate do something wrong? Should they have, quote unquote, known better? Was he advocating for himself or was he being self-entitled? I don't think that we can judge in this situation. I don't think it's a bad thing that people should ask for what they want. And I think that it's dangerous if people are punished for asking for what they want. If there's a procedure around new sodas, tell them what it is. If there's not going to be any changes, tell them that. Is there any way that we can be neutral in these situations? I really don't like the idea of people feeling like they can't ask for what they want. I think that having the tools to respond in a way that where we recognize that our reaction might be coming from something way back behind. I mean, who knows what, the leader in this situation, what that person's background was in terms of thinking that the soda collection was the best benefit you could ever imagine. And how could you possibly question what it is? I have to tell you something too. I have an Achilles around here where I feel like a rule has been broken, and maybe I will come to some new awareness through the process of, this podcast and this environment and potentially bringing on people who I can talk to about these very broad themes, and this one right now is about rules being broken. I have a really hard time when the people inside of my organization are asking our vendors for favors, whether they're asking for free things or they're asking for discounts, they want to bargain with them. I feel like they're doing something wrong when they do that. Technically, they're not really doing anything wrong. I think that I have two things that are happening for me. One is that I feel like they're offending the vendor in some way. And I don't know if the vendor is offended. They might deal with that all the time. It could be no big deal. And the vendor has tools to say yes or no. They can go with that as they want. I think the other thing that rubs me is that I get a little bit afraid that if the vendor is offended, and so that's the first thing that has to actually happen. But if they are offended and then I get grouped into this set of people that offends the vendor, and then the vendor doesn't want to work with me anymore. And then how am I going to provide the service that I need to provide if this vendor is no longer an option for our company? So there's kind of a few different things going on there, but ultimately there's an idea about a rule being broken and it might not be. So I just have to stay neutral and let people bury their own, dig their own grave if the vendor decides not to work. There are times actually when vendors have cut us off. So it's not totally unfounded. But again, going back to this, always asking, was there something wrong with the question here? I do believe that there was a rule broken in the executive's worldview, the one that had been asked for the new soda or whatever. Objectively, if no one is really drinking, given soda, diet A&W, why not replace it with something that folks will drink? I mean, that's kind of the objective response to that. A second example around reactions and how it can influence us, good or bad. This one is relevant to me, and it happened not that long ago in the fall of 2021. I deliver trainings in a number of offices, and this requires some coordination, not only with the people in the office, but also with a broader learning and development schedule that is put in place by people that are outside of my group. So every time I develop the schedule, I'm in touch with these people and make sure that there are no conflicts, and then, begin to send out invitations and do all of the things that are required, right? So this particular time I had 3 sessions in New York, and all of a sudden some of the attendees at one particular session were asking if they could be transferred into one of the other sessions. And I get this on occasion. There's always 1 or 2 people that need to switch for various reasons. No big deal, but it was becoming like a lot. It was noticeable. So I think I asked someone at some point, I'm like, is there something in your guys' schedule that's conflicting with this? And he said, yeah, this other functional group scheduled an hour with everyone. And I'm like, ugh, did this other functional group check with L&D? Now here is where my emotional response began to kick in. I mean, it was strong. It was really strong. And on the factually, the pain in the ass aspects of having to reschedule and there literally was not enough room in the room that I was using. So there were some logistical issues here. So I couldn't just jam them all into the same session. Plus, I like to keep the session small for other reasons. So there were things that were obviously frustrating around that. And also having to resend invites. I mean, I feel like I look like I don't know what I'm doing, right? And this is where it kind of gets to some of my internal fears. I don't want to be seen as conscientious. I go out of my way to think about everything that could happen. I am conscientious, and I want everyone to know that I am conscientious. I look ahead for these things, and all of this was making it look like I did not look ahead for these things. I want them to know that I'm careful. When I think about it even further, further self-reflection, I have a fear of looking accountable for things over which I had no prior knowledge. And I'm going to go step back, and this might, I don't know, people don't want to go here or whatever, but it's important if you really want to be self-aware and understand how you're behaving and why you're behaving the way you are. I went to school for many, many years where I had nuns, Catholic nuns, who constantly were finding things wrong with our behavior as little children. I mean, it was unbelievable. And later in my life, I've listened now to all sorts of research that's been done on this. And there really was a bent towards looking at children for what they were doing wrong. And it was the way of kind of raising kids in certain aspects and certain, this worldview definitely existed more years ago than it does now. And I will find that research too, because I'm pretty sure it was mentioned by one of the head psychology of happiness researchers who talks about this leaning towards just finding things that people are doing wrong. Anyway, so this thing about I had no idea, I don't want to be, I have a fear of being held accountable for things for which I had no prior knowledge. And the lesson for me in this is when I'm looking at situations like this and I'm feeling myself reacting and having this overwhelming emotional thing happen inside of me, is to go back and say, am I really accountable or responsible in this situation? I have to kind of say, you know what, Linda, you're innocent right now. And is there any action that you can take? What are the appropriate action steps? And so that's what I did in this situation. I did appropriately act. We were trying to get in touch with the other functional group to see if they could reschedule theirs before I started rescheduling all of mine. At a certain point, we didn't hear from them. So I started rescheduling all of mine. I did what I had to do, right? And acknowledging that I was not ultimately responsible. And I'm pretty sure that the attendees knew what happened and they knew that I was taking care of it in the best possible way. And I don't think anyone was accusing me of having handled it poorly. So those are a couple of examples. And if you find yourself sometimes embroiled in what should have happened, they're not doing it the right way. They're not, they are not. Why aren't they? Just just dig into that. I mean, we're going to react. We're going to be upset. It's frustrating. We have to redo a bunch of things. And if someone had only done it X way, then it would be so much better. But getting underneath that will lend itself towards the self-awareness and what's driving it. And when you can be a little bit easier on yourself. For me to take a more innocent approach to some of these and just execute on the things that I can, overall, I will have a better experience of my life because I'm not ruminating about it. I'm not worried about what 14 new hires think. I'm going to do my job well, and I've rescheduled, and it's going to work out fine. Ultimately, it's for my benefit. It's for my energy savings that I dig a little bit and I try to understand where my behaviors and my reactions are coming from. And ultimately, I look like a more professional person. I am a more professional person, and I'm respected more. I'm, as a result of these things that I'm doing because I'm motivated to, because it actually is turning itself around into giving me outside validation. But that's not what's driving me to do it. I'm learning about myself in order to execute more effectively, to be the professional and the brand that I want to be in the workplace. When you find yourself reacting from a mindset of what should have happened, just ask yourself what the inner assumption is. And then maybe try to go a level below that. Just try to keep going into those. What are the assumptions that my should is based on? This is a fantastic place for self-reflection and to build on your self-awareness. So right now I want to shift slightly or kind of move from here or grow from here to talk about what other defensive fear-based postures that we're operating from. Our internal reactions are a signal that something is happening, and how we react is often based on things that have happened before, way before our work life, things that are determinants, our family, our background, how we were treated as children, on and on. I'm going to read from a book that is by Ruth Soukup. I think I'm saying her name right. Ruth, Soukup. And the book is called Do It Scared. And she talks about 7 different fear archetypes. And we'll see if we can find the one that I was describing in my own situation in terms of not wanting to be held accountable for things that I am not responsible for. Oh, we're so messed up as human beings. I'm going to read through these. I think they're really interesting. And, none of us only has one. They're usually a crossover, and I think we all have some of them. So one of them is the procrastinator, and the procrastinator's primary fear is that they're going to make a mistake, and it manifests itself in perfectionism or fear of commitment even. So the negative traits, these people like to be right, and they spend too much time researching and planning. They have trouble getting started and feeling like things are finished. The positive attributes, though, are that they produce really high quality work. It's usually really well organized, and they pay extremely great attention to details. So in every negative or fear or whatever you want to call this, there's always a positive attribute. And something I'm going to get to later, I study a lot around the gene keys, and again, this is a whole big thing that I don't know how deeply I'll be able to get into in the podcast space, but this is all about, our gifts and our shadows, and that often the same sauce that creates the most fear in us or the most shadow negative behavior also within it has roots of our very best gifts. So whenever, even when I was talking about my concern about being accused of things that I'm not really responsible for, that makes me extremely conscientious. Like I said, I'm scanning constantly for what can I predict in this situation so that I'm prepared. That actually makes me a good contributor. So think like that, and you'll on to something really positive. The others is a rule follower. So I talked about rules a little bit ago. So the primary fear struggles most with outsized fear of authority, which often manifests itself in an irrational aversion to breaking rules or doing something that is perceived as not allowed. Negative traits gets nervous about not doing something the way that it's supposed to be done, may adhere to a rule or the status quo at the expense of their own judgment. Positive attributes is extremely trustworthy and responsible, possesses a strong sense of duty and right and wrong. It's occurring to me too as I read these that, bosses, if you
suspect, or if you kind of see some of these traits in your employees, like maybe, they're really need to know that they're doing something the right way. I mean, you can just kind of notice that in their behavior and just kind of give them a little bit of license, a little push to a little empowerment, hey, roadmap what you think the next, 5 actions are on this. How would you carry that? Just give them a little bit of leeway, a little bit of confidence that they can think of the next few things, even if there isn't like a clear rule book for how they should proceed. The next one is the people pleaser. Primary fear struggles most with the fear of being judged, which also manifests itself in the fear of letting people down and the fear of what others have to say. I think we all have this, right? Negative traits has trouble saying no and struggles to set boundaries, can be hesitant to take action, fearing what others may think. Positive attributes tends to be well-liked and fun to be around, is thoughtful, considerate, and generous, and is a great team player. The outcast, their primary fear, they struggle most with the fear of rejection or fear of trusting other people, a fear that often manifests itself by rejecting others before one has the chance to be rejected. Negative traits may outwardly appear to be fearless or unfazed by what others think, sometimes struggles as part of a team, and may seek out risky or self-destructive behavior. Positive attributes is self-motivated and driven to succeed, tends to be persistent, willing to take risks, and not easily discouraged by failure. The next is the self-doubter. Primary fear struggles most with fear of not being capable and often manifests itself in deep feelings of insecurity and fear of not being good enough. Negative traits feels paralyzed by insecurity and therefore stuck, often critical of others as a way to mask insecurity. How many of us are surrounded by people who are often just looking at what other people are doing wrong? Again, know that there's something hurt in there. There's insecurity in there. Then there's, compassion that we can lend to that. Positive attributes for the self-doubter. Is a very hard worker and willing to go above and beyond to do a good job. Can be kind, empathetic, humble, and a good listener. The excuse maker. The primary fear struggles most with the fear of taking responsibility, which can manifest itself as the fear of being held accountable or the fear of being blamed. Negative traits often makes excuses instead of progress, can be hesitant to lead or take charge, preferring others to make decisions. That's tough for leaders. Sometimes they need their people to make decisions. Sometimes leaders don't let their people make decisions. Positive attributes, it's a good team player and an excellent cheerleader, and can be a keen observer who learns from others' mistakes. And then finally, the pessimist struggles most with the fear of adversity, which can manifest itself as fear of experiencing hardships and difficulties or fear of pain. Wow, if we're avoiding hardship and pain, we're never going to evolve. We're never going to evolve. Negative traits, feels powerless to change circumstances, tends to see hardships as stop signs rather than stepping stones. Positive attributes, is sensitive and big-hearted, tends to be caring and compassionate, and is often a good listener. So in the book, Ruth goes on to discuss how to be courageous and how to understand more about the fear archetype and how to just know about it and how to work within it and how to lean more towards the positive attributes to the extent that we can. I think it's really important to build some self-awareness about when we're reacting, when we're having that kind of emotional response in our system to something that happened in our environment and what is underneath it so that we can be more neutral. We don't feed it so much, and we can have a better life when we get home at the end of the day and not ruminate so much. When it comes to these fears, I want to describe one tool or trick or antidote. And sometimes when I say antidote, it sounds like anecdote. Antidote, like, an antidote. When you identify kind of the negative or the thing that we're focused on that like me, maybe focusing too much on why the other functional head was problematic and me just being like pissed off at that situation, right? Like when we're really only focusing on what went wrong, think in big terms around what you want, right? So this is not, I want this to go away. It can't be like a semi-positive expression of the negative. It needs to be completely flipped. So in this, maybe it was, I want this thing to not be such a big deal. I don't want to, you could say, I'd like this thing to be more neutral for me in terms of reacting to it. You could say, I want effective resources to handle X. And then the next one is, I want to be successful and working through the right steps. Just something really broad. It doesn't have to be a beautiful ultimate end statement. It's just one way to begin to open your brain to the possibilities. So if you can't do this, if you just find yourself continuing to revert to how hopeless the situation is, how big the roadblock is, how it's never going to go away, things are never going to change. If that's where you continue to focus, that the change is going to require major outside force, nothing to do with you, you have no power over this, you need to gently acknowledge that this is a mindset that is actually serving you in some way, and that the more that you lean into this mindset, it's doing something for you. It might actually be more comfortable for you to not take action. It might be more comfortable for you to stay in a victim mindset. And I don't mean that to be disparaging or judgmental. And we'll talk about in a kind, careful way what these aspects of, why people end up in victim state. It's nothing, again, not disparaging or anything, just acknowledging that there must be some comfort there. That it must be more comfortable to stay there than to move in another direction, to even begin to think about an opposite statement that is positive. I think sometimes people get a little hung up here because when they say, I want effective resources to handle situation X, they think, well, I don't have those. I can't make that a statement. The resources aren't there. And that isn't it. You're not meant to figure it out right away. You're meant to kind of make the positive intention and then kind of wait for it, if that makes any sense. Confirmation bias is real. Look up Beider Meinhof. When you buy a new car, all of a sudden you see that car everywhere on the road, right? It doesn't mean that car all of a sudden is driven by more humans. It means that you are now focused in on that car because you just bought it and you're very, and all of a sudden you see it. So we see what we're looking for. If you are looking for what's not working, you are going to see more of what's not working. If you look for solutions, you might actually notice that colleague C seems to be handling this okay. What could I do to mirror or model what that person is doing? Ask how they're approaching situation X with openness. You could say, I find X challenging. Do you find X challenging? How do you approach X? Sometimes you just think that there's special treatment going on. And maybe there is special treatment. Maybe the treatment is different because, say it is a boss subordinate situation and the boss seems to be treating one employee better than a second employee. If employee A is easier to work with, it's going to feel different. That treatment, that interaction is going to feel different. It doesn't mean that the boss wants necessarily to treat them differently or that they want to play favorites. It just might mean that, maybe the boss needs skills development and working with various people, but there's so many dynamics here. There's so many different variabilities and traits in human beings that clearly certain relationships are going to have more grease than others. So you've got to provide some grease, and then maybe grease will come from the other side. Just try putting in a little grease first. You're going to this person who you see seems to be handling something better. Or maybe you're not even noticing that. Maybe you think this person doesn't have the challenge at all, but hey, I experienced this in my work. Do you experience this in your work? And then how do you handle it? And a lot of people like to be asked for when they do things well, for advice and such. And it really is opening you up to new possibilities and a way of thinking about your work. If you can't think of a solution right away, if it doesn't come to you, again, for me, it's more like an inner declaration that I'm assuming that something is going to occur to me on how to work through this. And usually it does. And the more that I just kind of make the intention of, I'm going to have a solution for this. I'm not going to worry about it right this second because I have other things I can do right this second. And the more I do that, the easier those solutions come into my life and, just kind of appear, or it'll occur to me the right person to talk to about it or something like that. So give these things space. Earlier when I was reading from The Power of Agency, he talks about, just the ability to pause before you react. And that is a huge lesson here, even if it's just a beat or a breath, just a pause. So going back to all of these fear archetypes and that sometimes we literally are scanning our environment or emails, or all of these things with a shield of protection because it's built into our biology, from what Brene Brown was saying before. But really, when we're doing this, we're making threat our reality. So I'm bringing awareness to this so that you can understand if it's something that exists for you. Or if you think that it's something that exists for someone in your work environment, you can be more aware of it, more compassionate, maybe bring some tools to them without you're not calling it out. You're just lending a more human approach, a more, they might just have things going on that make it more difficult for them to be open. And you could ask the right questions and help to draw them out a little bit more. We'll be going over examples and ways of dealing with this. All of this is for your own personal growth and for the growth of an organization, and so that you can produce and create and evolve and do all of the awesome things that we are here to do. And any of these transactions, whether it's an email or, a weird conversation or someone asks something that we don't think is appropriate, always pause, right? And then just pull out the action items. What here is for you? What are your responsibilities in this various, communication? How can I add to help move this thing forward or to move it to completion, whatever that means? And proceed as the good human you are, the good human that you want to show up as, whatever that brand is that you're bringing to the workplace. That's how you are going to proceed in the situation. Assuming that no one is after you is great. Assume that no one is accusing. Assume positive intent, and it will start coming back to you. You are safe, and your role is valued. So wrapping up here, we went over a lot of things, right? Ultimately, we have control over the three things: our actions, our reactions, and our mindset. And today we talked a lot about reactions and then some actions we can take from that. And I have found the more that I start acting in these ways that are more positive and that are more, acting from a place of agency and self-empowerment, the more my mindset changes. It's like the action changes the mind. Some people think that you have to think it first. I don't know. It goes back and forth. Absolutely. Actually, I'm going to read something really quick from Psychology Today, and I hope that people don't have issues with Psychology Today. I think that it's a fantastic place for information, and if you don't agree with what I'm about to read, that's cool. But I think you're you're kind of denying a really powerful aspect of the human system. Earlier, I talked about Greg Louganis and visualization. So this is what I was saying is from Psychology Today. Brain studies now reveal that thoughts produce the same mental instructions as actions. Mental imagery impacts many cognitive processes in the brain: motor control, attention, perception, planning, and memory. So the brain is getting trained for actual performance during visualization. So we talked about it in terms of it allowing me to have a better result with cheerleading, at least the first and second years, if not this other 2 years. But being able to use visualization even in the workplace can be huge, and it can help with your mindset. I kind of lean towards action first. If we can dominate or lean towards actions that kind of have a positive mindset behind them, it can be influential. We'll talk about this more in other episodes, but leaning in towards self-awareness and taking good action can begin to affect your mindset, because things will start coming back to you in a much more positive way. So we've talked about email and tone, and really how you can just be a little bit more neutral in your response, and what are you reading into things. Again, how can we stay neutral? When we're reacting to things in a very emotional way, quite frankly, our beliefs are coming through. What rules are being broken, what beliefs are being challenged. Try to get underneath that. See if your belief makes sense for everyone to hold and share. It might not. We talked about threat and fear archetypes, and we all have them. And how can we lean more into, maybe the positive side of, these things can lend themselves to positive attributes. And we'll talk more about how to lean more towards away from the fear aspects of ourselves. I also talked about a couple of antidotes to behaving with a defensive posture. And one really is thinking in terms of what you want, making those positive statements. And the other one I mentioned earlier in the podcast was about knowing what you need to be successful, right? So you're being clear on with whoever you're working with, whether it's your team or your boss, what is the success, align on what the success is, scan for the resources, and then ask for what you need. I know that a lot of people in frontline roles feel like they don't get what they need. And sometimes their whole posture and the way that they talk it's just dripping with this is how you're not serving me, boss. And it just makes it harder for the boss to serve you. And again, none of us are perfect, but just how can we add grease to the situation so that we have a more effective work experience? All of this is information for us to reflect upon in order for us to build self-awareness. That was a lot. Little tips and things to think about. I find that sometimes certain things will lend themselves to more thought, and I'll have little aha moments throughout the course of time after I've heard something for the first time. And I hope that can happen for you too. And if there's anything that you want to share as it relates to content here, if you have stories of things that have happened to you or things that you know about the way that you react or others react in work environments, I invite you to record them on your phone. You can use, just an app, a voice recorder app on your phone, and then email them to me at linda@workdopepod.com. It's linda@workdope, WORKDOPEPOD.com. And I will use it in some way, whether it's playing it on air or, engaging you further for a conversation or such. I hope you have a fantastic week. All right. Bye-bye. Well, there you have it. Episode 2 is in the books. I want to leave you with some references here. These are some of the mentions throughout the episode in case you want to dig further and maybe look someone up. One is, I mentioned Greg Louganis, and yes, he did win gold medals, and he won them in 84 and 88. Fantastic figure to go up and look up if you've not heard of him before. I also mentioned Tim Ferriss, who has a podcast with his own name in it, and also he's the author of The 4-Hour Workweek. It's just one of his books. I also mentioned the psychology of happiness, but really positive psychology is the terminology there. And the person that I was referencing was Martin Seligman, and I had heard him on a podcast talking about some of the issues around how children were raised, at a different time or how things are changing around that. I also mentioned the gene keys, and that's a big, huge topic. The person behind the gene keys is Richard Rudd. He's written a bunch. You could look him up on YouTube if you're curious. Again, I might go into what it is and how it might have relevance here in future episodes. I cited a Psychology Today article, and the title of the article is Seeing is Believing, the Power of Visualization. And that was an article by AJ Adams. And I want to say again, having listened through again, that I was going back and forth between which comes first, mindset or action. And really, it's almost simultaneous, because by the process that I lay out, you're kind of looking at whatever the negative thing is or the thing that you're complaining about, and then you're creating that opposite statement. And as you begin to create the opposite statement, you're stating what you want, and not just by saying like a semi-positive of the negative type of thing. You are beginning to change the mindset just by shifting that. And you're using your mind to do that, right? And then you're creating action to support whatever that new thing is that you've stated. I just wanted to say that after having listened through. And you plug for the next episode. It is like the episode around, get your shit together to reduce losing your agency to overwhelm Max. So that's a lot. But basically, how can you better, really this is about self-mastery and executing really, really in a way that your mama would be proud. Again, if you have any stories that you want to share, egregious things that have happened in your workspace, absolutely record them on an app from your phone, some kind of voice recorder, and email them to me at linda@workdopepod.com. That's WORKDOPEPOD.com. And until next time, this is Linda Stacy signing off for Work Dope. Bye-bye.